Good afternoon, everyone. When Corey and I were talking some time ago about what topics we thought would be very timely and interesting at this point, we quickly came to the idea of the end of war. The United States is in the process of trying to end a couple of wars that we're in right now. Iraq, maybe we're not ending that. Maybe we're starting that one again, not sure. But Iraq and Afghanistan. And there is surprisingly little law and little policy about how to effectively end wars. We all think of the signing of the peace treaty on the battleship, that ended World War II. But that's really, in a sense, the exception as opposed to the rule. And so as we thought about this, we thought, this is such an intriguing topic. Who could we bring that could really enlighten us on this subject? And my mind immediately went to Laurie Blank. I've known her for a long time. You've all read her bio. She was in private practice. She worked for several years at the United States Institute for Peace. She now runs the only law of armed conflict clinic in the United States and potentially in the world, as far as I know, and does some absolutely fabulous work, which I hope she gets a chance to mention in her presentation. She's the co-author on this book, which if you want to understand international law and the law of armed conflict, this is the book to read. So she is, in fact, an expert on this, and I would invite you to pay attention to her and to, when we get to question and answer, feel free to ask her very difficult questions, because she is smart and has all the answers. Laurie.
Thank you very much to both of you for having me and for such a nice introduction. I should have brought Professor Jensen's book, and then I could hold that up and say, this is the other very important book that you need to have if you want to understand this topic. I think maybe we could combine them one day. But I'm very happy to be here, especially to get a chance to spend a little bit of time in the mountains. I was enjoying being outside this morning. And happy to come and talk to you guys today about this topic. Put that a little bit aside. So the end of war. We can think about this a couple of different ways. One way, which I'll mention, but then I'm going to put aside, is to think about, well, how do we end war as a thing? And this is something the international community has been trying to do for quite some time. It doesn't take much more than a cursory look at news coverage to see that we have been reasonably unsuccessful at this attempt. But starting in the early 1900s, we had attempts by treaty with the League of Nations, the Kellogg-Briand Pact, a variety of attempts to outlaw war as a means by which states would resolve disputes. It hasn't worked that well, as we can see. It is absolutely a noble endeavor, but I'm going to put that aside. That's one area of legal and policy and moral and ethical thinking that's critically important. But what I want to talk about today is, how do we think about the end of a war that's going on? So not how do we end all wars, but we have wars. How do we think about each individual one coming to an end, and what does it mean? We can think back to historic concepts and we think, well, when two states fight against each other and they stop fighting, the war is over. Unfortunately, we don't have that kind of clarity today. So just as an introductory point, why does it matter? Why does it matter that we can demarcate an end to a war? Or could we just kind of say, well, it seems to have trickled to an ending, withered away, died out in some way? Well, it's critically important from a legal perspective because the authorities, the obligations, and the rights of people, of states, of groups are different during wartime and during peacetime. It matters in terms of how a state or another group can use force against an enemy, how people are protected in the context of that force being used. So we would call that targeting. It matters there. It matters in the context of detention, because during war you can detain enemy personnel until the end of a war without charging them, basically taking the other guy's fighters off the battlefield. It matters in the context of accountability, because during war you have the opportunity to use different forums for accountability, whether it's a court-martial or military commission or other things. Outside of war, you don't have the same authorities. You have a different set of constraints and a different set of regulations, protections, permissions, and so on. So it matters solely in the context of what can you do, how do you protect people, how do you prosecute people, how do you detain people, how do you take action as a state or as a group. Outside of the legal context, it also matters in the rhetorical context. We talk about war in the rhetorical sense as a huge sweeping effort to struggle against something that we consider to be an evil. A war on poverty, a war on drugs, war on, pick another social evil or effort. We have a war on terrorism. Talk about that a little bit more. So when we think about the impact of rhetoric on how we then conceive of domestic law, domestic authority, the ability to take action, to come up with different policy decisions, the rhetoric is important as well. So with that as a frame, the first point when we think about the end of war is, well, what is war? If we're going to talk about it ending, we kind of need to know what it is in the first place. So in the political context, I would say war is a struggle against an enemy. Usually we think of it as a struggle using armed force, but again, we could think about it in this rhetorical construct. Sort of the classic international law definition, historically, is a contention between two or more states using their armed forces for the purpose of overpowering an enemy and imposing conditions of peace that the victor wants. Fighting against another state, either taking their territory, getting them to stop trying to take your territory, whatever the issue might be. Now we have a more comprehensive legal framework for what war is. And instead of using the word war, we use the word armed conflict. Why is this? Because historically, states would use the ability to manipulate the term war and say, well, we're not really at war, so we don't have to follow the law of war. The law of war is a centuries-old framework that applies during wartime and, as I mentioned at the beginning, governs how parties fight against each other, how they treat people, and so on. So you had examples like the Japanese in the 1930s and early 1940s with their operations in Manchuria. If you're familiar with this at all, the Japanese invaded Manchuria, engaged in unspeakable atrocities, and then claimed it wasn't a war because therefore they didn't have to be following all these laws that applied during wartime. They said it was a police operation. The U.S. has done this sort of thing as well also. We said operation in Panama in 1989 wasn't really a war. They invited us, etc. A lot of playing around with words pre-World War II. So after World War II, we have a set of treaties called the Geneva Conventions, which you may have read about, may have studied a little bit. And they set out the modern law that applies during wartime. But what they also do is tell us what is war. How do we know when we have it? So just quickly, we have war between two states is an international armed conflict. You have two states fighting against each other. Pretty simplistic, pretty straightforward, and easy to identify. It's usually easy to identify the beginning. It can be pretty easy to identify the end. But we also have something called non-international armed conflict, which is anytime you have a state fighting against some kind of group that's not a state, or maybe you have two of these armed groups fighting against each other, or many of them. Think about Syria, right? We're not even sure all the different groups that are fighting there, but we do know that there's, at least as best we know publicly, the only state actively involved in the conflict is the Syrian regime. I'll leave that for another discussion, perhaps if you ever take Professor Jensen's, one of his many classes as to whether other states are actually involved in the conflict. But this is a little bit more complicated in terms of figuring out when this kind of conflict starts. And really what I want to talk about today is how do you know when it ends? So how do we know when it starts? Well, normally what we look for is some level of violence that meets a threshold at which we would go beyond the state taking action in the normal course of law and order to restore security, to restore public order. And we look at a couple of things to identify this. What's the intensity of the violence? How much fighting is going on? What kind of weapons are being used? How many people are being killed? How often are these two sides fighting against each other? And we look at the organization. So are these people fighting against the state? Are they organized as a group? Can we identify an enemy? Right? Essentially, it's like the expression, you need two to tango. You need two to have an armed conflict, to have a war. Otherwise, you have a state using violence against kind of a group of individuals, which has its own issues. So if we use this as background, the next question I would ask when we talk about the end of war is, well, which war? I don't think the U.S. is entirely clear how many conflicts it's engaged in right now and exactly against whom. They might be clear in the Situation Room, downstairs in the White House, in the National Security Council, at the Pentagon, but certainly not presenting a very clear picture to all of us. We know there's a conflict in Afghanistan that we are winding down. That conflict is against the Taliban in general, partnering with the government of Afghanistan and lots of other states involved in the international operation there. But we're kind of also fighting against a lot of other groups in the context of the conflict in Afghanistan. Groups kind of operating out of the northwest provinces in Pakistan, whether it's the Al-Haqqani Network, the Pakistani Taliban, other groups. But that one at least is reasonably structured as we look at that conflict. We could look at the conflict in Iraq before the current situation. So rewind back a year or so ago, and we could look back at the conflict in Iraq, and we could say, well, it started as between the U.S. and Iraq, along with other countries in a coalition with the U.S., and then it became the U.S. helping the new government of Iraq against a bunch of insurgent groups, and we at least saw an end of U.S. involvement in that because we left Iraq. That's usually a pretty good tell that that conflict is over for U.S. purposes. We left. We had no more troops there. There was probably still a conflict going on between the government of Iraq and other groups. What about all these other conflicts going on? We have a conflict with Al-Qaeda. That's sort of been the driving conflict since 2001. How do we define that one? Is it Al-Qaeda and all other terrorist groups? Or do we have individual conflicts with all of these groups? What about new conflicts with ISIS and other groups in Syria like the al-Nusra Front that we don't really care for, but we're not quite sure whose side they go to? If you've seen some of the news reports over the last few days, it's clear that there's no clarity about who's doing what in Syria. I think, the chaos would be the obvious word, but we don't quite understand the linkages and the relationships between the different groups there and who is trying to get advantage in what way. And if we work with somebody, what does that mean in terms of somebody else that we don't like? Do we end up helping them when maybe we don't want to? Or is this a war against terrorism? Is that really what this is, broken down into lots of little pieces? Is this essentially a rhetorical political war against terrorism, terrorist groups writ large, and it manifests itself in smaller chunks? Here's Al-Qaeda, here's Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, here's Al-Shabaab, here's pick your favorite other group. There's many of them. So that makes the rest of the discussion that I want to have with you guys a little bit more difficult, because if I can't really tell you, well, which war am I talking about when I talk about how it ends, it sort of seems, well, maybe we should focus on that for a while. But I don't really know how to answer that question. And I think that the U.S. right now, we have a mix of they don't want to fully tell us what they think the answers are, because the government wants to retain a lot of flexibility, a very valid goal for a state. They want to have policy flexibility. Too much information, too many conclusions provided in the public discourse is only constraining for states' future action. And I think they're also not entirely sure, which isn't so bad, except it's very difficult to say publicly. As you may have seen a few months ago, we had the president say, well, we don't really have a strategy yet for dealing with ISIS. I heard that on the news and I thought, you have got to be kidding me. Like, it's okay if you don't really have a strategy, but don't tell us that, right? But let's say that we're working with some of these ideas. These are the conflicts that we're thinking about. How do they end? So what does it look like? Well, again, historically, right, as Professor Jensen said, you might have a peace treaty signing on the deck of a battleship. Civil War ended with the signing of a peace treaty. World War II, World War I, yesterday, right, the 95th anniversary, is that about right? Math? Yeah, 1919. So that works in the interstate context. You have two sovereign entities, they sit down, they agree to stop fighting, or maybe one of them has completely defeated the other and swallowed it up. We've seen that lots of times as well. What about in the state versus non-state context? This gets more complicated. Think about Colombia and the FARC. Think about Sri Lanka and the Tamil Tigers. Think about lots of other conflicts between a state and a rebel group, an insurgent group of some kind. How do these end? Do they end because they actually agree to stop fighting and maybe the state recognizes some of the insurgents' demands? Yes, that could happen. Do they end where the state completely obliterates the rebel group? Sure, that's Sri Lanka. They cornered them onto a peninsula and they shelled them until they killed everybody, essentially. That's one method. Not the one I would recommend as the most legally appealing method for doing that, but so you could see we could have more identifiable ways, or you could also have the insurgent groups melt away into the jungle or desert, or depending on the geography of the country, and you don't really know. Are they going to come back and fight or not? How do we know? Is quiet evidence of the end of conflict? Maybe. But now let's make it really complicated and put it in the counterterrorism context. So you're not really talking about a state fighting a group in its own territory where the state has at least pretty good knowledge of what's going on, control of the borders maybe, certainly a lot of sovereign authority. Now you have a terrorist group outside your territory and you're fighting against this group in some way. How do you know when this ends? And here we have to think about how terrorist groups organize themselves, how they operate, because what might have been complicated before is now extraordinarily murky. So I'll give you an example of maybe how these might end. So the one that was most sort of publicly discussed in the last year or two was the idea of a tipping point. This was presented by the former General Counsel of the Department of Defense, Jay Johnson, now the Secretary of Homeland Security. And he talked about the idea that we were making so much progress against what he called core al-Qaeda. So that's essentially the remnants of the original al-Qaeda terrorist group, that we were going to reach a tipping point in this conflict. And the way he described that is that so many al-Qaeda leaders would be killed or captured, and the group could no longer launch strategic attacks against the United States, so that al-Qaeda as we know it is effectively destroyed. That was how he described this tipping point, at which point we would say there's no longer a conflict with al-Qaeda. That sounds pretty workable. The problem is, how do we know they can no longer launch strategic attacks? Is it because they're not doing it? It's really hard to know that with a terrorist group. Is it because we're foiling them and so they can plan them, they can start them, it's just that our defense has gotten pretty effective? How do we know it's destroyed? How do we know it hasn't just become 6 other groups? The Khorasan group in Syria, which we've said is the biggest threat to the U.S. in Syria right now, is apparently a very small group of al-Qaeda operatives who have now been reconceived of as this Khorasan group. Does that mean al-Qaeda's been destroyed, or that it's done what terrorist groups tend to do, which is morph, change, splinter off, reconfigure? Because if they stay in a conventional organization, that's the end of the terrorist group, right? That's how the state can find them. So they always are going to do that. Well, another way I might think about looking at the end of a conflict with terrorist groups is, right, it would start to go in fits and starts. So the spacing between episodes of this conflict would get larger and larger. Or you might just have a gradual dying out of violence. But for either of those, you have the same issues. Why is it happening? Is it because the other group actually doesn't want to fight anymore? Because to me, that's really the end of conflict. The other group is not trying to fight you for any number of reasons. And we don't have the ability to tell that with a terrorist group, as best that I can tell. So, I think we can look at this in a couple of different ways, right? We can look at this in a practical, operational approach. What actually does it look like using some of these ideas? We can look at it from the legal framework. What does the law tell us? It doesn't tell us a whole lot. Basically, the sum total of the international law that tells us how to identify the end of a conflict is a couple of phrases. One is the cessation of active hostilities. That's when prisoners of war have to be returned, repatriated back to their country. The other is the general close of military operations. That's when the Geneva Conventions, many of the obligations in there cease to apply. How is that understood? Well, when we look at the treaties and how they were understood at the time, we look at what's called the commentary to the treaties, and that says, well, this really is when the last shot is fired. Again, pretty easy to think about when you think about trench warfare in World War I. How do I know with a terrorist group as the enemy when the last shot is fired? Because they may not be doing anything because they're planning something really big. And they're getting it all ready. And they're waiting for the state to become complacent. And the longer you wait, the more complacent the state gets, which means your big thing will be more effective. Which leads to a question that I find very problematic and challenging, which is, could war continue indefinitely in the context of counterterrorism? So if we can't figure out what it even means to end it, just practically, I'm not even talking legally, let's stick with the practical. Well, then is it just always going on? To me, the answer has to be no to that. It's really difficult to conceive of a situation in which we have a permanent or perpetual state of conflict in some way. So I prefer to try to think of that as, well, let's come up with another answer, because that answer is unsatisfying entirely. In the same speech where Jay Johnson talked about the tipping point, he said, well, after this tipping point, we would no longer have an armed conflict, which has legal meaning, with al-Qaeda. Instead, we would have a counterterrorism effort against individuals who are the remnants of al-Qaeda. I'm not really sure I know what that means either. Counterterrorism effort. Well, war, I mean, make it a little more robust, you're back to a conflict. So, couple other thoughts. You have to think about, how do you measure the goals of a conflict with a terrorist group? You're trying to destroy their capability, destroy the group altogether maybe, or degrade their capability. These are all possible goals. Because when we think about terrorism, and when you read about terrorism in general, sort of the conventional wisdom is that you can't defeat terrorism, you manage it. You can't make it go away altogether. You manage it in a way that it will be less disruptive to your society, that there will be fewer root causes for people to engage in terrorist acts and to take up terrorism as a political means of trying to achieve a goal. But I don't think you get rid of it altogether. It's a phenomenon. It's an ideology. It's an ism. It's not something you defeat entirely. So, and if you think about, like I said, what al-Qaeda has splintered into, you can see, well, we went from one somewhat centralized conflict with al-Qaeda to several existing or potential conflicts with smaller groups. seems we're in a conflict with Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula and Yemen, either directly between the U.S. and AQAP or as assisting the government of Yemen against them. Al-Shabaab, well, we've launched a bunch of drone strikes against them. I don't think we've gotten to a point where we meet the legal definition of a conflict, but we got some violence going on. They appear to potentially want to take action. They've taken action in Africa against Western targets. What about Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb? Is it only if we go there to assist the government of Mali or others that then we have engagement with them? Or are they trying to plan attacks? What about al-Nusra? What about other groups? I don't know. Can we use the law to try to answer this question? So the law tells us when you have a certain level of intensity, a certain measure of organization, when the government has to resort to its military to deal with a threat, that's when you have a conflict, an armed conflict in the legal sense. Some people have suggested we should reverse engineer that. You have a conflict going on between a state and some non-state group. Okay, well, when it gets down below that threshold, you need the threshold to have the conflict. If you get to a situation that goes back below the threshold, no more conflict. It's enticing, and I think it's probably the way to start thinking about this, but I want to raise some questions with it. Can you use these same factors to think about the end of conflict the way we think about the beginning of conflict? I think organization is the biggest challenge here. It may be somewhat easy to tell when a disorganized group of protesters or people coalesce into something organized where they have somebody in charge, whether you want to call it responsible command, a hierarchical system, somebody making decisions and they act in a coordinated manner. Well, when a group then splinters into multiple groups, or cells go dormant, or they have sleeper cells that we don't even know about, are they now less organized, or are they just organized differently? Intensity. Usually we're going to see, like right now, we have not had a terrorist attack on the U.S. homeland, I don't know, in quite a long time. Is that because they can't? Is that because we are, as I said, our defense is very effective? Can you measure intensity when it only comes from one side? So we're still launching drone strikes against terrorist targets periodically. Or do you have to have stuff going from both sides? So I think that's a challenge. It's a bit, to me, disingenuous for a state to say, well, we still have a conflict going on because we're still launching drone strikes. Okay, well then stop and we won't have a conflict going. I mean, you can see how relying solely on one measure becomes very problematic. So let me give you an alternative, also from the law. The law of armed conflict, the law of war, says one of the fundamental principles is the principle of military necessity. This is the principle that gives authority to a state or another group to take lethal action against an enemy during conflict. And what it says is that a party to a conflict can use all force necessary to achieve the complete submission of the enemy as quickly as possible, as long as you're not using anything that's prohibited by international law. Complete submission of the enemy, this makes sense when you think Germany, France, when you think, U.S., Soviet Union. That's how you defeat another state. That's what we accomplished in World War II against Germany and Japan. Unconditional surrender. So you're not going to have an end with a terrorist group that looks like that. So I've been thinking about this. What does complete submission of the enemy mean in the counterterrorism context? Because if you use that as your measure, well, boy, you've got permissive authority forever. Right? Well, we need to achieve the complete submission of Al-Qaeda. Well, does that mean you no longer have any radical preachers preaching an Al-Qaeda-like ideology? Because, my children will have grandchildren by the time we get to that point. I think that's a problem. One last lens to look at this is looking more operational at the idea of a threat. Because when you think about what is conflict, where is conflict going on, who is conflict against, all of those questions are integral to understanding when the end of war is. You have to think about the nature of the threat and how the state views the threat and what it needs to do to react. If you divorce those analyses from the operational analysis, you end up basically having an ineffective conversation, because if you can imagine the person who's doing that, they're talking to an operational person and they're like ships passing in the night because they just can't find the same wavelength to talk to each other. So the state is going to act based on the threat. So how do we handle this? A state uses operations, they subdue an enemy so they can't launch attacks very effectively. Can the state continue to act on the basis of a perceived threat, like this group still wants to do us harm? Or do they actually have to wait till the threat reconstitutes itself in actual concrete manner? This is important in terms of what the state has authority to do. In the former case, it can continue to take action with the permissive authority of the law of war, even when you don't see a lot of action from the terrorist group. In the latter case, where it has to wait till there's some concrete manifestation, it goes back to a law enforcement construct. And then, right, you may see some rebuilding of violence and conflict, and now you're going to say, oh, the conflict is starting again. Now we apply the law of war framework. Last point that I want to make we can have some discussion is to go back to the rhetorical context. And I think it's important to realize that we can't look at the idea of the end of war without considering the rhetorical context. Because if we find a legal construct that gives us a pretty good sense of when a conflict with a terrorist group ends, outside of that, outside of the law of war, outside of armed conflict, states still have the authority to take forceful action in self-defense. So we have examples of this throughout history. You don't have to have a conflict going on to use deadly combat power, but your use of that is highly restricted against an imminent threat or those who have launched an armed attack. Well, now, mix that, right, the ability to use force in very narrow, discrete situations with the continuing rhetoric of a war against terrorism. And you can see that you're going, and actually, well, we can look back at the last decade or so. You don't have to just imagine it. You can have significant consequences for how we look at the balance between national security and individual rights. So if we take action that is purely in self-defense, but we call it part of a war on terrorism, the legal confines for that self-defense action begin to erode, and we begin to think of that again as war. And we have significant problems that can arise. And just a couple of them are, what do we call the people that we're fighting against? When you see a lot of the discussion about Al-Qaeda, we always talk of them as terrorists. We don't really ever see people using the word suspected terrorists. But until someone is convicted of an offense of terrorism, and there are offenses in our domestic law, really they're a suspected terrorist. But that word suspected just went right out the window as soon as we started talking about a war on terrorism. Well, because now they're enemies. They're not criminals, they're enemies. And, you know, then you get people saying things like, well, we're at war with these people. So therefore, we can do, and there's your litany of things that the government wants to do that is less confined than elsewhere. So, for example, all terrorists should be put in military custody, right? We had debates in Congress about this last year. People who are arrested for potentially planning a terrorist attack. Maybe it could be the Boston Marathon bombers who don't appear to be linked in any way that I know to Al-Qaeda. It's a massive and horrible crime, but it doesn't appear to be part of a war that the U.S. is involved in. Why should they be in military custody? The answer is because we think of it as a war on terrorism, so everything as part of it, right, gets subsumed into there. So I think it's important to recognize the impact of the packaging as well. So I'll leave it at that. I want to make sure we have enough time for questions.
I invite you to come up to ask questions. Please tell us your name and what you're studying, and get right into it.
So my name's Eric Smith, and I'm studying neuroscience. And I just had a question about, like, I guess recruiting measures with ISIS. You talked about like solving the roots that's causing the terrorism, and I was just wondering if you could go into that a little bit deeper.
I think there's a lot of people doing a lot of work on, and we need more people doing this. How do you keep a generation of young people, and obviously those who are not young anymore, but still drawn by the radical ideology? What are the ways that you try to prevent them from being enticed by radical ideology? And it seems to me from what I've read, I haven't dived into that sort of more sociological and context myself, but education is a big part of it. And I think it seems to me from what I've read that it's a disaffectation from the society in which somebody is located that tends to lead to that. So people who leave Western society, for whatever reason, they seem to feel that the society that they're in is not satisfying their needs. Why that does, I couldn't begin to answer because it doesn't draw me at all. But I think that's a very different issue from how do you defeat it once it's started, right? That's how do you keep more people from being drawn by it, which is also a different situation from how do you take action to keep people who are drawn from actually going there and joining up, right? Many layers. The immediate, and those are sort of short-term, medium-term, long-term. Short-term is how do you fight a group that's trying to fight against you? That's one issue. How do you keep more people from joining them? That's the middle term. And the long term is how can we get to a state in 40 or 50 years or maybe even 20 years where this does not have the draw that it has anymore? And I think that has to do with development and education and access to opportunity. A lot of these countries where you see the radical ideologies gaining a lot of popularity, the younger generation has no opportunity. You read about in Tunisia right now, which is, I guess, considered the success story of the Arab Spring, success being defined somewhat modestly, but nonetheless, it is proceeding with a new constitution, some type of democratic governance, and yet there are a lot of Tunisians, young Tunisians, who are going to join ISIS. And why is that? And they're not seeing the opportunity for themselves in Tunisia, and they're somehow seeing opportunity there.
Coming up, if others want to ask questions, please feel free to form a queue. We can call it that here.
So my name is Hudson McKay. I'm studying public relations here. So I just want to get your take on where you see the war on terrorism within the next. I know there are a lot of factors that can contribute to this, but where do you see the United States stance on the war with terrorism within the next 5 to 10 years?
Well, my answer is going to depend on who wins the White House in 2016, I think, in some respect. But I think that we have, over the last several years, moved sharply away from the idea of a war on terrorism, right, which was the initial construct after 2001, after 9/11. Like, we're at war with all terrorist groups as manifested in Al-Qaeda, but really anybody, and we're going to defeat terrorism. Well, first, it's hard to be in a war with an ideology. We kind of tried that with communism in the Cold War. You could have said we never said that, right? We never said we're in a war against communism. Interesting. I never thought about that before, but I wonder if that was ever raised. But essentially, we have now moved into, if you look at the way the U.S. talks about it, they are beginning to get closer to their European allies, at least in the discourse. We're at war with Al-Qaeda and associated forces. Associated forces is where our allies can't follow us because they don't know what that means. I don't really know what it means. It's sort of the U.S. way of bridging the gap between we're at war with all terrorist groups, but we want to be more confined about it. I think we are going to head in the direction of more discrete action against specific actors, against smaller groups, to try to both nip in the bud those smaller groups becoming larger transnational entities, but also because I don't think the groups are going to become that. I think what we're seeing is sort of the next generation of radical Islamic ideology where we have many, many groups with separate goals and entities and like some sharing of ideology, but can't quite agree, so they're not willing to join up particularly. I think we're going to see that now. The reason I say it could depend on what happens in 2016 is I think we could have if you continue on that path, you will end up where we start classifying what we're doing as counterterrorism rather than armed conflict. We still call it armed conflict. Calling it armed conflict allows us to detain people without charge, target people on the basis of their membership in the enemy group. If it's not armed conflict, you can't do those things. You have to be much more individualized. So I think, and I hope, ultimately, that we will move more towards a counterterrorism construct rhetorically, because then that means that we're going to be using more limited authorities, and some situations may spark back into an armed conflict. Fine, that's, that happens. We also, though, could end up, depending on the next administration, renewing the armed conflict model, reinvigorating it even. And part of that depends on what happens with ISIS, and whether this administration or the next one decides to subsume a lot of other radical terrorist groups within the counter-ISIS effort. And so I'd say we're kind of at a juncture. It's not clear where it's going to go. And I think for the folks who are trying to think about direction, they have opportunities there, right? The world, the way the situation is presenting opportunity to define and categorize the situation in either way. So I guess stay tuned.
Thanks.
Hi, my name is Matt. I have a quick question. So we keep talking about all these international agreements, laws, and treaties, everything. But why bother if in time of war a lot of these are disregarded? Especially the U.S. Why even bother go through all these lengths of truly? From often a realist point of view, it doesn't really matter.
How much time do I have for this question?
3 minutes.
You want the 30-second answer or the 30-hour answer? Why bother? Why follow any law during war, in essence? So there's a variety of reasons. And I'll start by giving you the framework. One of my good friends who is a lieutenant colonel in the Marine Corps does a lot of training of young Marines on these issues. And, same kind of questions. Look, the other guys are committing atrocities. They're not respecting any of our rights and protections, so why should we follow this? Got a couple of possible answers, and as far as I'm concerned, it's pick and choose. Any of them work for me. But then we can move on to a bigger picture. So he gives them a couple of examples. Well, first of all, it's the law of the land. The U.S. is a party to the Geneva Conventions and to many other treaties. Treaties under the U.S. Constitution are the supreme law of the land. So they are the law in force. So why should U.S. soldiers, Marines, airmen, sailors follow it? Well, for one thing, it's the law. So if you don't, you're breaking the law. That's one reason. There's not a lot of moral or ethical foundation in that. It's simply kind of why you follow the speed limit when you might think you could safely drive faster on that road, but you know you're going to get a ticket. Another option, and the second piece of that really is another option, right, is you could get punished if you don't, right? We follow it because our country's decided this is the legal framework, so have all the other countries. Good enough. Another one is, well, I'm going to be court-martialed if I break the rules, and I might go to jail. And we have evidence of that, whether it's Sergeant Bales, who walked into a village in Afghanistan and killed 16 people in a village, or others, get punished. That's the very realist utilitarian argument, right? You do this, you have consequences. The last one is it's the morally right thing to do, right? And why is it the morally right thing to do? And here we get to really the foundations of the law of war and why we have it. And historically, how did it grow? It grew as a combination in every single culture. It exists in every culture. So it's not a Western imposed idea. Out of kind of two ideas. One was that just the basic idea that when you fight, you're fighting an enemy and not an entire people. You can see historic examples of, whether it's in the New Testament or the laws of Manu in India or wherever, like, when you lay siege to a city and you capture it, you can kill all the men, but you must only enslave the women and children. By today's standards, not particularly liberal interpretation of how you should treat people, but if the alternative is kill everybody, you're seeing an idea that war should be regulated. So that's one piece, but it also grew out of reciprocity. I'm going to protect your prisoners because I want you to protect mine. That's it. So what does the law do? Why do we follow it? Because it protects our people. Even if we have lots of examples of them not being protected, we have lots of them actually being protected. Why did we treat Vietnamese, Viet Cong fighters as prisoners of war? Because we wanted, and I could have made you an argument that they didn't fit into the category, et cetera, et cetera. We were generous in our categorization because we wanted them to treat captured American flyers as prisoners of war with some, not kill them, basically, because they were executing all the American flyers that got shot down. So reciprocity then grew into the idea of a universal obligation. But why should it matter? Because there are values, right? We shouldn't fight by the other guy's values. So you have two choices. We have our values that have been grown out of history of, and basically what the law of war is it's kill the enemy, but if you capture him, treat him with dignity. That's sort of the best encapsulation. And don't kill anybody else that you don't need to kill, and don't destroy anything else that you don't need to destroy. But use every bit of force you have to defeat the enemy and destroy their stuff. So it's a very interesting balance. You can be actually trying to kill somebody, and then you capture them. And not only can you no longer kill them, you have to protect them. Not just not kill them, protect them. It's this instant switch between deadly combat power and a chivalrous obligation to protect. So you have your choice. You can fight by the other guy's values of beheading people and torturing them and whatever, or you can fight by the values that we've set out. To me, it's not it may be hard operationally, but from the moral sense, if you take on their values, then you're becoming like them.
Okay. Thank you.
I don't know if that helps.
Thanks.
Okay, my name is James Hodgson. I'm studying political science. What do you think are some of the domestic or maybe societal issues, especially legal issues, that we may have that lead the U.S. into so many of these conflicts?
I guess it's a mix of we're the only ones who can fix certain problems, or at least we feel that way. Yeah. We may not be so great at fixing them, right? We tend to go in to fix, and then the fixing is where the devil's in the details, right? And we're the natural representative target for all disillusionment with sort of modernity, Western values, industrial development, whatever it is that seems to be the radical ideologies that reject sort of coexistence and modern development and freedom of expression. They're going to find the U.S. as the manifestation of that. And so I think the combination there, right? We put ourselves in positions, and then essentially by doing that, we draw the ire, right, of other groups. I don't know. I'm not sure the right answer is to say, well, let's not go and help anybody. But that's easy for me to say sitting in my cozy office in Atlanta and not being out on the front lines. It's another important thing to remember.
Hi, my name is Nicole Galbraith, and I read that this week there was a radical group in Egypt that pledged allegiance to the Islamic State, and I was just wondering, like, why do you think they did that? Was that for the resources? Do they have the same ideology? I'm not really sure. And do you think that more radical groups will start joining with ISIS like they did? And I know you mentioned how it's easier for the state to kind of target those radical groups if they all start getting bigger and joining instead of splintering. So do you think that more will start joining, or I don't know?
So, and this actually raises another really interesting question. I hadn't read about that, and my instinctive guess is they do that to get attention, right? Because otherwise they're just local, yokel, radical group in Egypt. You know, no offense to them, but now they say they're pledging allegiance to ISIS, and boy, they're going to get attention because that's the enemy du jour, right? So I don't know whether there were more operational reasons why they did that, whether they had some, I don't know if that was done out of an actual two-way conversation with leaders of ISIS, like we are, or if it was just, we agree with you and we're going to support you. If it's the latter, it's got to be attention, public attention. But it raises a really interesting question, because currently we are engaged in an armed conflict with ISIS. We're doing that as providing assistance to the government of Iraq against the threat posed by ISIS. As a result, that means that in the actual conduct of hostilities against them, the U.S. can target members of ISIS, people fighting for ISIS, solely on the basis of their membership. We don't have to wait and see if that actual person is getting ready to shoot, launch an attack, do something hostile. The simple fact that they are part of ISIS's armed group means that we can target them, we can attack them. So now this group in Egypt says they're pledging allegiance. Do all those people become basically status-based targets? That is far-fetched to me. But one could make that argument. That's this whole idea of associated forces, right? Co-allies in a fight. I think that's problematic, because now, look, you're going to have you're spreading the violence to Egypt, right? You want to think about what that means. But it does raise, I think, an interesting question there.
Thank you.
Last question.
Corey Chipman, European Studies. Given the Boumediene precedent for the United States extending habeas corpus rights to potential enemy combatants, it's kind of blurry there, but like you said about terrorism, can we extend those same rights to foreign nationals in countries that are being targeted by drone strikes? For example, your recent law review paper on the topic. And should we extend our own citizenry rights to foreign nationals in that way?
Meaning just people living in Iraq where we're targeting ISIS, or?
Right, our man over the age of 18 enemy combatant who can be targeted and without reprisal, like you said, in armed conflict.
So the question of extending habeas,
Yes.
right? So habeas is basically show me the body. Mm-hmm. You have somebody in detention, you don't just get to keep them there without letting me, the judge, see them and agree with you that there is authority to detain. You have to come and bring the person before a court and explain why you have the authority to detain. So in terms of other constitutional rights, at present, the U.S., I think, is still fighting the extension of any other constitutional rights to detainees at Guantanamo in terms of like Eighth Amendment cruel and unusual punishment or Sixth Amendment rights in terms of trials and things. I think they haven't ruled on anything with that, have they? No. So we may see a larger extension of constitutional rights to the detainee population at Gitmo. The only issue where the Constitution comes up in any way with regard to targeting outside U.S. territory, and I think it's a red herring, but here's where it has come up. You have a U.S. citizen, let's call him Anwar al-Awlaki, who we killed in a drone strike 2 or 3 years ago now, who is a member of Al-Qaeda or whatever other group we're fighting against. Can we kill him the way we could kill any other member of that group, or is there something about his U.S. citizenship that requires us to do more, to engage in another level of analysis, to arrest him rather than kill him? And there was a lot of discussion about this, but like I said, I think it's a red herring, because put that in a different context. I don't know the stats, but there were a lot of U.S. citizens fighting in the German army in World War II. And we never asked for driver's licenses when we had some kind of engagement with a German unit, right? Because you fought army to army. That's how a war is fought, right? It's not so individually personalized. If a U.S. citizen goes and joins an enemy, they don't have some greater protection than the others in terms of being targeted. They're a member of the enemy. They can be targeted on the basis of that membership in a conflict. So I don't think there would be any extension. I don't see any way the Constitution would now apply to others, because it really applies to U.S. nationals or people within the territory of the United States. But that doesn't mean there's no law protecting people in the course of conflict, right? That's what the whole body of international law, the law of war, is designed to do. So individuals who are targeted, they are protected in certain ways. They can't be, you can't use weapons against them that cause unnecessary suffering. That's one protection. People in the area who are not involved in the fight are protected from attack. Okay, they're the innocent civilians, they can't be attacked. And they're protected from being incidental harm, from being what we call collateral damage. So there's lots of protections. Even if we keep the U.S. Constitution in our pocket, we've got lots of other law that provides protections during armed conflict.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and
Thank
thanks
you.
for your questions.